The wind came from the north, steady and sharp, pressing cold into every crack of the timber frame house until it creaked like an old man's bone. Snow had started before dawn, fine as sifted flour, and by mid-morning it blanketed the range in a gray hush. The barn roof sagged under the weight of it, and the cattle stood motionless beneath the low trees, rumps turned to the wind. Thomas Callahan sat on the porch steps, boots planted in frozen mud, his coat open though the wind needled his chest. He held a tin mug of coffee gone cold, untouched since he poured it. The frost had rimmed the lip. He didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. His eyes were fixed on the narrow track that wound down from the ridge, the only path in or out for 15 miles. Nothing moved but the snow. 3 nights ago, a rider had come through with a telegram from Fort Bennett. The ranch hands watched Thomas take it open. It read it twice. He didn't say a word, just folded the paper and walked inside. That was all. But the next day he rode out before first light, didn't say where. He came back last night after the fire had burned low. The men heard his boots crunch the gravel but stayed quiet. When he opened the cabin door, they saw the snow on his hat and shoulders and 3 children behind him. A girl with a swollen eye and a broken locket around her neck. A boy who wouldn't speak, not even when offered bread. And a baby wrapped in an old army coat asleep in the girl's arms. Thomas didn't explain. He just said, "We'll need more firewood," then carried the baby into the room. He never let anyone enter. Now he sat on the steps like he had nothing left in him. The wind tugged at his collar, lifted his hair in quick gusts. His hand clenched once on the mug, then eased. The girl had cried herself hoarse that night, then quieted. The boy hadn't made a sound. No one had asked what happened. The answer was there in the bruises, in the way the girl flinched when the fire popped. The ranch dog, old Jesse, limped over and lay beside him with a grunt. Thomas didn't reach to pet him. His eyes were still on the ridge. Out there was a decision he hadn't made yet, though part of him knew it had already been made. Inside, the baby started to cry. It wasn't loud, just a thin, uncertain sound, but it cut straight through the air like something sharp. Thomas set the mug down on the step. The frost cracked under the base. He didn't rush, but he went inside. The girl was by the stove, trying to warm her hands. Her name, if she'd given it, had slipped from his mind, or maybe never stuck. She looked up fast when he stepped in, then back down just as quickly. The boy sat by the hearth, staring at the fire like he was trying to fall into it. Thomas crossed the room and lifted the baby from the bed. The child squirmed, red-faced and cold, but quieted once his arms closed around her. He hadn't held anything so small in years, not since his own girl who'd come and gone in a single winter back when his wife still wrote letters and the war hadn't turned him into a ghost. The baby's breath warmed his neck. He pressed her tighter to his chest, felt the way her heartbeat pulsed like a bird's. He turned to the girl. She got a name. The girl hesitated, then nodded. Clara. Thomas looked at the boy. And him. The girl didn't answer. Her eyes went flat. He nodded once, not pushing. All right. The wind slammed the door behind him as he stepped outside again, Clara in his arms. The sun had started to break through in patches. Across the white fields a hawk circled once, then dove hard. Nature didn't care who hurt or who healed, but he did. Or maybe he was learning to again. He held the baby higher, close to his face, breathing in her warmth. A stranger had left 3 children on his doorstep, and Thomas Callahan had decided they were his now. The girl didn't speak much that first week. She rose earlier than expected for someone so young, and took to sweeping the floors like it was punishment she owed. Her eye had turned the color of spoiled plums, but she never flinched when the wind blew the shutters open, or when one of the ranch hands slammed the door too hard. She just worked in silence, glancing now and then at the baby like she expected her to vanish. Thomas noticed. He watched without making it look like he was watching. She fed Clara with slow, careful hands, rocking her near the stove until the baby drifted to sleep. The boy's silence still hovered near her, always between her and the door. On the fourth day, the girl ventured a question. "Where's your wife?" Thomas was splitting kindling out back when she asked. He didn't look up. "Gone." She waited for more, but he didn't offer it. The wind had died down that morning. The sky was the pale blue of porcelain, brittle and empty. Smoke drifted slow from the chimney. The silence between them stretched long enough that she thought he might be angry. But then he said she left when the grass stopped growing. The girl frowned. "That don't make sense." He gave a dry half-smile. "It don't." Inside, the boy was stacking wood by the stove, each piece lined up perfect. The girl had shown him how, and he did it over and over, like order could make things safe. Thomas had tried to ask his name once more, but the boy just stared at him like a deer looking down the barrel of a rifle. By nightfall, the baby had started coughing, a wet, rattling sound in her chest. The girl sat up with her dipping rags in hot water, holding them to Clara's back. Thomas sat nearby, oiling his rifle. Not because he needed to, there wasn't much to hunt this time of year, but because the sound soothed him. It was familiar, predictable. She had a father, the girl said suddenly. Didn't want her. Thomas looked up. Her eyes were shadowed in the lamplight, but her voice didn't tremble. "He said he'd take me and Jody back, not her." She paused. "Said he'd leave her in the creek if I didn't hand her over." Thomas set the rag down. "That when you ran?" The girl nodded. 3 days walking." He said nothing. What was there to say? "I thought maybe you'd give her to someone, but you didn't." Thomas leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "A man who turns his back on a baby ain't much of a man." The girl blinked fast. Her lips pressed tight. She turned back toward the baby, who had quieted. "She's warm now," she whispered. He rose and placed another log in the stove. The fire sparked and flared, washing the room in gold. In the corner, the boy stirred, eyes half closed, but watching everything. "You got a name?" Thomas asked gently. The girl hesitated. "Maisie." He nodded. "Maisie. All right." That night, Thomas stayed by the fire long after the children had gone to sleep. He watched the flames curl and twist, felt the heat seep into his bones. Outside, the moon hung low, lighting the snow like a quiet revelation. This place, empty for too long, held new sounds now, small ones. The rustle of blankets, the whisper of breath, a soft hum from a girl who'd seen too much. It wasn't peace. Not yet. But it was something close. If the journey mattered, subscribe for more. Winter eased its grip slowly, like a reluctant hand unclenching. The snow turned to slush by mid-morning, then froze again at night, leaving the yard crusted and treacherous. Fence lines sagged under the melt, and the air smelled faintly of rot and pine. Spring would come as it always did, but it was still far enough off that you could forget what green looked like. Maisie learned to haul water before sunup. She'd stand on the back porch with her coat flapping around her knees, waiting for the pump to thaw. Her fingers were red and cracked, and she never complained. She watched how Thomas saddled his horse, how he moved quiet through chores, how he seemed more at ease around cattle than people. The boy, Jody, followed her like a shadow. He'd started to talk, just barely, single words, mostly to Maisie. Never to Thomas. One morning, Maisie caught Thomas staring at the hills beyond the south pasture. "You looking for someone?" she asked. He didn't answer at first. Then no. "Just making sure they ain't coming." Maisie stood beside him, pulling her coat tighter. "You think he'll try?" Thomas's jaw moved. "If he's the kind that leaves a baby in a river, he's the kind that might come back for trouble." Maisie nodded. "He drinks." Thomas looked down at her, eyes narrowing. "You mean always?" "Since Mama died." He'd sit in the barn, wouldn't talk for hours. Then, He'd come in like a storm. Her voice was flat. One time he burned my hair with a lamp. Said I looked too much like her. Thomas's stomach turned. He didn't let it show. "I can keep you safe," he said. She gave a small nod, but it felt like she didn't believe it. Not yet. He meant it, though. The fence around the house got reinforced. A new lock went on the barn door. He started carrying a pistol again, not because he expected a fight, just because it was better to have it and not need it. That same week, Jody followed Thomas out to the woodpile. "You ever split logs?" Thomas asked. The boy said nothing, just stared. Thomas set a thick piece of pine on the stump. "Come here." Jody walked over slowly. Thomas handed him a small wedge and showed him how to hold it, how to feel the grain in the wood, how to angle the axe so it didn't glance. The first swing missed completely. The second cracked the bark. Thomas didn't correct him, just waited. By the fifth swing, the wood split. Jody looked up at him then like he didn't quite know if it was allowed to be proud. Thomas ruffled his hair without thinking. The boy stiffened, then leaned into it. That night, Maisie made biscuits from scratch. They were dense and slightly burnt, but Thomas ate 4. When she saw his empty plate, her face lit with something soft and unfamiliar. After supper, he found her sitting on the porch with Clara in her arms, rocking slow in the twilight. "She likes your voice," Maisie said as he stepped out. "I don't talk much. You don't have to." "She knows." Thomas sat beside her, the rocking chair creaking under his weight. The sky was bruised, purple stars just starting to flicker out. "She didn't cry once today," Maisie whispered. "That's the first time." The baby stirred, then settled. Thomas could hear the wind in the grass beyond the yard, soft as breath. He cleared his throat. "You're doing good." Maisie smiled faintly. "You too." And that was it. No big declarations. Just the sound of 2 chairs rocking in rhythm and the baby's breathing and the slow, steady unfolding of something like trust. The thaw came fast once it started. Snow gave way to mud and the horses kicked up more than they carried. Calving season arrived in a blur of cold mornings and long nights. Thomas worked dawn to dark shoulders, aching hands numb, but never once asked the ranch hands to stay late with him. He preferred to be alone out there, or he used to. Maisie started coming with him. At first just to hand him tools or hold a lantern. Then she began learning. How to spot a breech birth. How to check for milk. How to rub a half-dead calf back to life with burlap and prayer. "You ever name them?" she asked one morning, brushing straw off her knees. "No," Thomas said. "That's a mistake." She tilted her head. "Why? Harder to sell what you've named." She nodded like she understood, but the next day he found her whispering names to a pair of twin calves behind the barn. Jody tagged along when he could. He wouldn't go far from the house without Maisie, but he watched everything, hands in his pockets, mouth closed, eyes sharp. Thomas didn't push. The boy would come around in his own time. One morning, Thomas found an old harmonica in the drawer beneath the sink. He wiped it off and left it by the hearth. By dusk, it was gone. Later that night, he heard a thin, wobbly note from the corner room. Someone learning to play Breath by Unsure Breath. He didn't say anything. Just listened, eyes closed, while the fire cracked and the baby slept sound in her crib. The house felt different now. Less like a waiting room for ghosts. But nothing lasts without cost. That spring, a man rode up the main road. Dusty coat, sour smell, horse limping on a bad shoe. He called himself Denton Clark. Said he was kin to Maisie and Jody. Thomas didn't shake his hand. Clark looked past him at the yard where Maisie was hanging sheets on the line. "You got my brother's kids," he said. Thomas's stance didn't shift. "You Denton or William?" Clark spat into the dirt. "William's gone. Burned out in Sioux Falls." Thomas didn't answer. Clark sniffed and squinted toward the barn. He wrote me. Said if anything happened, I was to come collect his blood. You'll be glad to be rid of him, I reckon. No man wants extra mouths. Behind them, Maisie stood, frozen clothespin still in her hand. Thomas turned. His voice was quiet. You can go inside, Maisie. She didn't move. Clark smirked. She always this disobedient. Thomas stepped off the porch. You'll leave now. You don't got the right to say that. I do. Got any papers say they're yours? Thomas's jaw clenched. No, but they are. Clark sneered. You think a judge'll agree when I show up with blood and a name and you got nothing but a soft heart? Thomas said nothing, just looked at him. Clark shifted. Fine. You'll hear from me. He mounted slow like he hoped for a parting word. None came. Thomas stood in the yard until the man disappeared down the road, dust rising behind him like smoke. Maisie approached. He'll come back, won't he? Thomas looked down at her. He might. She swallowed. He'll take us. No, Thomas said. You can't know that. He crouched beside her. You hear me now? No one's taking you. I'll fight it. With law, with fists, with fire if I have to. Maisie didn't cry, but her hand found his sleeve held tight. That night Jody climbed into Thomas's bed and didn't say why. Just curled up like a pup. Thomas didn't move him. The next morning they started talking about the future. Maisie asked what it'd take to make the adoption legal. Thomas said a good lawyer, a patient judge, and a reason. You're my reason. That spring the ranch didn't just grow calves. It started to grow roots. Summer came in hot and dry. The grass burned gold under the sun and the wind felt like breath from a furnace. Dust hung in the air most days, fine as flour, and everything creaked, the house, the saddles, the bones in Thomas's hands. Still he worked. They all did. Maisie had taken over the kitchen without being asked. She baked, cooked, cleaned, even kept track of the storeroom. You're too thin, she told Thomas once, pushing a plate of beans and cornbread toward him. He didn't argue. She was right. Jody spoke more now, mostly to her, sometimes to Thomas. He'd taken to carrying that harmonica in his coat pocket. Never played it around anyone, but Thomas heard him sometimes in the barn, soft little whistles of sound like he was letting something free he didn't quite understand. Clara was crawling. Teething, too. She'd cry through the night, red-faced and wild, but quiet down when Thomas held her close and hummed under his breath. He didn't know the tune, just something that came out of him raw and low. They settled into something like rhythm. It wasn't ease, life on the range never allowed that, but it was a pattern, a shared effort. Days blurred into each other, but with meaning now, with purpose. The only weight that hadn't settled was the threat of Denton Clark. They hadn't heard from him again, but Thomas knew better than to mistake silence for surrender. He'd been to town twice in the last month, both times visiting the clerk's office, asking careful questions, filing quiet paperwork. No judge would rule without a hearing, and Denton had family blood. But Thomas had something else. Stability. Proof of care. And maybe if he could find it, witnesses. He started talking to the ranch hands, asking them to write what they'd seen. The bruises. The state the children arrived in. He didn't tell Maisie, not yet. Didn't want to feed fear. Then one afternoon, as the sun baked the yard and the wind died to nothing, a letter came. A rider handed it off and left without a word. Maisie found Thomas on the porch, boot on the rail, eyes on the horizon. She held out the letter. He read it once, twice. What does it say? She asked, voice thin. Court date, August 3rd, Fort Bennett. Maisie's face changed, but not with panic. Something steadier. Like bracing for a blow you've waited your whole life to stop flinching from. We'll go, she said. Thomas nodded. She added, and we'll win. He looked at her. You believe that? She didn't smile. I have to. That night, Thomas sat by the fire after they'd all gone to bed. He held the letter in one hand, the edges softening from where he'd folded it over and over. He thought about the years he'd lived in this house alone. The silence. The dinners with no conversation. The porch with no laughter. He thought about how Clara's tiny hands gripped his shirt when she was scared. How Jody had started calling him sir without flinching. How Maisie left wildflowers on the windowsill without saying a word. He'd built a ranch with his hands. Now somehow he'd built a family. He set the letter down. Outside the moon was rising full and pale. It lit the yard, the barn, the line of sheets Maisie had hung to dry. They danced in the breeze like ghosts finally laid to rest. The road to Fort Bennet was dry and unforgiving, the kind of dust that clung to your skin and settled in your teeth. They left at first light, the wagon loaded with water biscuits and the quiet kind of hope that knows better than to speak aloud. Thomas drove, reins steady in his hands. Maisie sat beside him, Clara cradled against her chest beneath a cotton shawl. Jody rode in the back, knees pulled tight to his chest, the harmonica pressed to his lips, though no sound came. It was 50 miles of hard country, and no one said much. When they reached town the next evening, the sun was sinking low, bleeding red across the wooden buildings. Fort Bennet wasn't big, but it carried itself like it was important. Men leaned in doorways, watching strangers like stray dogs. Children ran barefoot down alleys. A church bell rang in the distance, long and tired. Thomas had wired ahead. A room waited above the livery, and the stable took his horse without question. Maisie wrinkled her nose at the smell of the place, but said nothing. In the room, Thomas lit a lamp and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. Jody stared out the window. Maisie fed Clara soft bread soaked in milk. "You sleep here?" Thomas said. "All of you. I'll be outside the door." Maisie looked up. "You think he's in town already?" Thomas nodded once. "Probably, Blobley." She bit her lip. "I'm not scared." "I know." The next morning the courthouse loomed above the town square, tall and gray, like it had no memory of kindness. Inside, everything smelled of old paper and sweat. They sat on a bench in the hallway waiting. Clara fussed in Maisie's arms. Jody wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Then the doors opened and Denton Clark walked in like he owned the air. He'd shaved, wore a suit too big for him. But his eyes were the same, narrow, searching, cold. He glanced at the children and smiled. "Not kindly?" Thomas rose. Clark's lawyer was a thin man with slick hair and a thick file. Thomas had no lawyer. Couldn't afford one. But he had records. Letters. Statements from the men on the ranch. Proof of care. Of stability. Of love, though the law didn't always know what to do with that word. The judge was old, with a face like dried bark and no time for sentiment. He listened. Took notes. Asked questions in a voice that didn't rise or fall. Maisie spoke clear and low. Said what happened. Said what didn't. When asked if she wanted to go with her uncle, she shook her head hard. "He's not my family. Not anymore." Jody didn't speak. But when the judge asked who took care of him now, the boy stood, walked across the room, and sat beside Thomas without a word. That said more than anything could. Clark argued. His lawyer used words like obligation and inheritance. Claimed Thomas had no legal right. Called this arrangement irregular, temporary, dangerous. But when asked what he did for a living, Denton stumbled. When asked if he'd provided for the children before their father's death, he had no answer. When asked if he knew Clara's name, he got it wrong. That sealed it. The judge took a long moment. Then he spoke. "In the eyes of this court, blood matters. But so does action. So does choice. Mr. Callahan, you've made yours. This court honors that." Maisie didn't cry. but her fingers found Thomas's sleeve and her shoulders slumped with the weight falling off of them. Jody exhaled the breath he'd been holding for days. Clara babbled nonsense into the room loud and bright. Outside the sun had shifted. The dust looked different now, like light instead of burden. They went home in silence, but it was a full silence. Not fear, not waiting, peace. By the time they rolled back into the valley, the cottonwoods along the creek had turned yellow. The days shortened. The wind took on a dry edge, whispering change through the tall grass. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop at the gate and sat there for a long moment. The house stood quiet, just as they'd left it, with a soft curl of smoke rising from the chimney. One of the ranch hands must have started the fire. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Maisie climbed down first, still holding Clara against her hip. Jody followed, his boots crunching in the gravel. Thomas took the reins in one hand and touched the brim of his hat with the other, like tipping it to the land itself. Inside, the rooms held a strange stillness, as if they'd been waiting. Maisie went straight to the back room and laid Clara in the crib. She smoothed the blanket over her chest, then stood watching her for a long time, arms crossed, eyes wide open. "She's ours now," she said, barely louder than a breath. Thomas leaned against the doorframe. "She's always been." Maisie looked over her shoulder. "What now?" He thought about that, about the seasons coming and the ones behind them, about what it meant to raise children on land that gave nothing without asking everything in return. "Now we work. We build. We keep going." Maisie nodded slowly, like that answer had weight to it. "Good." Later, Thomas found Jody out by the fence line, hammer in hand, fixing a split post without being told. The boy looked up, squinting against the sun, then back down, swinging careful and clean. It was the first time he'd done it without being asked. Thomas said nothing, just stood nearby and watched until the job was done. That evening, the house filled with sound. Clara's laughter, Maisie humming a hymn no one taught her, Jody tapping the harmonica on the windowsill like a habit he hadn't yet given up. Thomas sat in his chair, boots off, eyes half shut, and for once didn't think of all the things that could still go wrong. After dinner, Maisie pulled something from the drawer, a small bundle wrapped in worn cloth. "I made these in town," she said. Inside were 4 small pieces of copper, each stamped with a single letter, MJC and T. Thomas turned his over in his palm. It wasn't perfect, the lines were crooked, the edge rough, but it caught the light just right. "They ain't much," she said, suddenly unsure. "They're enough," Thomas replied. He strung his onto a leather cord and tied it around his neck. Jody followed, nodding his with both hands, a quiet grin slipping through. Maisie's fingers trembled as she put hers on. Clara's was sewn gently into the corner of her blanket. The wind outside picked up, rattling the porch swing. The night had grown cool, and the stars came out one by one like old friends returning home. Thomas stepped out onto the porch and looked toward the dark hills. Somewhere out there things still waited. Weather time, maybe danger, but they'd faced worse already. And what he had now, what they had, wasn't something he'd ever give up. Not again. Inside, laughter rose again. Light spilled out the windows. The house was no longer just shelter. It was theirs. And it would hold. The frontier rewards the patient. Subscribe and stay.